Everything seemed normal on the flight until a flight attendant suddenly yelled at a young boy. The passengers were shocked, but no one could have predicted what would happen next. Just 10 minutes later she was fired right in front of everyone. What went so wrong on that flight? Stay with us to find out. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story don't forget to subscribe for more. The airplane cabin was in with the usual pre-flight activity. Passengers were stowing their luggage, adjusting their seats and chatting quietly. Among them was a young boy named Daniel who sat next to his mother Sophia. Daniel's eyes sparkled with excitement as he looked out the window, his small hand gripping the armrest tightly. It was his first time on a plane, and he couldn't stop asking his mother questions about how it worked, how high they would fly, and what the clouds might look like from above. Sophia smiled warmly, answering his questions with the patience only a mother could have. She was proud to share this moment with her son. Daniel was dressed neatly in a colorful shirt and jeans, his favorite backpack sitting on his lap. Inside were snacks, a drawing book, and a few toys he had chosen carefully for the trip. Sophia, a single mother, had planned this vacation for months, saving every spare penny to make it special for him. She wore a simple but elegant blouse, her hair tied back neatly, and carried a calm but slightly tired expression. The flight was supposed to be the beginning of a well-deserved break for the two of them. As Daniel leaned slightly into the aisle to get a better view of the cabin, a flight attendant named Nancy walked past briskly. Nancy was in her mid-40s, her uniform crisp, her hair tied back in a severe bun. She carried herself with an air of authority, her sharp eyes seeing the rose for anything out of place. When she spotted Daniel leaning out, her expression hardened and she stopped abruptly. Sit back properly, young man, she said loudly, her voice sharp enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. Daniel quickly pulled back, startled, his wide eyes now filled with confusion. Sophia immediately stepped in, speaking softly but firmly, "I'm sorry ma'am, he's just excited. It's his first time on a plane." Nancy didn't seem to care. Her stern gaze shifted to Sophia. "This isn't a playground," she snapped loud enough for others to hear. Several passengers glanced in their direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Sophia's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she placed her hand protectively on Daniel's shoulder. "It won't happen again," Sophia said calmly, trying to de-escalate the situation, but Nancy wasn't satisfied. She shook her head and muttered something under her breath before walking away, leaving an awkward silence in her wake. Daniel looked up at his mother, his excitement replaced by confusion and a trace of sadness. "Did I do something wrong?" he whispered. Sophia's heart sank at the question. "No baby," she said, her voice soothing. "You didn't do anything wrong." Unbeknownst to Nancy, her behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. A man sitting in the first class section had been observing the entire exchange. His name was James Reed, a reserved but sharp-eyed executive with the airline. He had been quietly reviewing documents on his tablet but had paused the moment he heard Nye's raised voice. His brow furrowed as he watched her demeanor and noted the reactions of the passengers nearby. Something about the interaction didn't sit right with him, and he decided it was time to step in. James Reed set his tablet aside and adjusted his tie before standing up. His tall frame moved gracefully down the aisle, his eyes calm but focused. As he reached the galley where Nancy was busy arranging drinks, he cleared his throat. The sound startled her and she turned abruptly. "Excuse me," James began, his tone polite but firm. "Could I have a word with you about what just happened?" Nancy blinked, her demeanor shifting to defensive. "Is there an issue, sir?" she asked, though her tone lacked the same confidence she displayed earlier. She glanced past James as if hoping another passenger would interrupt. "Yes there is," he replied, his voice low enough to avoid drawing too much attention. "I couldn't help but notice the way you spoke to that child and his mother. It seemed unnecessary and unprofessional." Nancy stiffened her lips, pressing into a thin line. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Children need to follow the rules, especially during rep-in. Safety comes first." James nodded slightly, his Eyes narrowing. I understand the importance of safety, but I also understand the importance of treating passengers with respect, especially when they haven't done anything wrong. That child wasn't disrupting anyone and your tone was entirely out of line. Nana's cheeks flushed faintly and she quickly looked down at the clipboard in her hand. I wasn't trying to be disrespectful, her words trailed off as she struggled to come up with a defense. James's voice became a touch firmer. I've worked in this industry long enough to recognize when someone's actions are driven by more than just protocol. I'd like you to consider whether your response to that family would have been the same if they looked different. Nye's head snapped up, her face paling slightly. I don't know what you're implying, she stammered, her grip tightening on the clipboard. I'm not implying anything, James said, his expression steady. I'm asking you to think about it, and for now I'm going to request that you focus on your duties without further interaction with that family. Understood. Nancy nodded stiffly, unable to muster a response. James turned and walked back toward his seat, his expression unreadable as he passed Sophia and Daniel. He paused for a moment. He gave Sophia a small nod as if to silently assure her that she wasn't alone in this. Sophia returned the nod cautiously, unsure of who he was but grateful for the unexpected acknowledgement. Daniel, who had been busy sketching in his drawing book to distract himself, didn't notice the exchange. Meanwhile, passengers nearby began whispering among themselves, some clearly aware that something significant was unfolding. Nancy stood frozen in the galley, her mind racing as she realized this wasn't an ordinary passenger. She had crossed. The weight of James's words settled over her, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to fully understand their meaning. Nancy returned to her duties with a forced smile, but her movements were stiffer, her confidence visibly shaken. She tried to carry on as though nothing had happened, but every glance from a passenger felt heavier than usual. Her earlier certainty now felt like quicksand beneath her feet. Despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the growing unease. No eyeing at her. Meanwhile, James pulled out his phone and sent a discreet message to one of his colleagues on the ground. He explained the situation briefly and requested a report on Nye's history with the airline. James wasn't one to act impulsively, but he knew there was more to the story than what he had witnessed. This wasn't just about a single interaction, it was about ensuring the airline upheld its values. Sophia noticed the subtle tension brewing around her. She could feel the eyes of other passengers lingering, some offering sympathetic smiles while others quickly turned away. When she glanced back, she leaned down to Daniel, who was busy coloring in his sketchbook, and whispered, "You're doing great, sweetheart, just keep drawing." "Okay." Daniel nodded, his small hands carefully shading in the edges of a cloud. The cabin grew quieter as the last few passengers settled in, but the atmosphere remained charged. Nye's action had shifted the energy on board, and the subtle discomfort was palpable. In first class, James remained composed, his focus unwavering as he monitored the situation. Minutes later, Nancy entered the galley again to prepare for takeoff, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged the beverage cart. Another flight attendant, Rachel, stepped in to assist her. Rachel was younger and had a more relaxed demeanor, her bright smile a stark contrast to Nye's strained expression. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked softly, noticing Nye's unease. "I'm fine," Nancy snapped, though her tone betrayed her nerves. She quickly busied herself avoiding Rachel's gaze. Rachel didn't push further but exchanged a concerned glance with another crew member nearby. The growing tension was hard to ignore, and Rachel had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about a routine conflict with a passenger back in the main cabin. Sophia adjusted her seat and glanced at Daniel, who had begun to hum softly as he sketched. She leaned back and closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She wanted to let the incident go, but the memory of Nye's harsh words lingered. It wasn't just what had been said, it was how it had made her feel, as though she and her son didn't belong. James, now seated, glanced out of the corner of his eye toward the galley. He saw Rachel quietly speaking with another crew member, their faces tense. He had seen this before, the quiet ripples of discontent spreading through a team. If there was One thing he knew, it was that unresolved issues like this could escalate quickly. As the plane prepared for takeoff, James's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out discreetly and read the message from his colleague. The report on Nancy was brief but revealing. This wasn't her first complaint about inappropriate behavior. James's jaw tightened as he realized this wasn't just a one-time lapse in judgment, it was a pattern. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, his decision now clear. This wasn't going to wait until the plane landed. He leaned back in his seat, his mind calculating the next steps for Nancy. The next few minutes would define her career, and she didn't even know it yet. The plane had taken off smoothly and the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew moved through the aisles, ensuring passengers were comfortable. Nancy avoided eye contact with the passengers in Daniel and Sophia's row, focusing instead on first class. Her face was tight with forced composure, but inside her nerves were unraveling. She couldn't stop replaying James's words, each one digging deeper into her confidence. In the main cabin, Sophia watched as a different flight attendant, Rachel, stopped by with a kind smile. "Hi there," Rachel said softly. "Is there anything I can get for you or your son?" Sophia hesitated, then shook her head. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, though her voice carried an edge of weariness. Rachel's warm smile didn't waver. She crouched slightly to meet Daniel's eye level. "What are you drawing, buddy?" she asked gently. Daniel looked up, his big eyes lighting up as he held up his sketch pad. "It's a plane flying through the clouds," he said proudly. Rachel nodded, her smile widening. "That's amazing, you've got real talent," she said, her tone genuine. Sophia felt a rush of gratitude for Rachel's kindness. It was a small gesture, but it helped ease the sting of Nancy's earlier behavior. Rachel gave Sophia a reassuring nod before moving on to the next row. As she left, Sophia noticed a few other passengers giving her encouraging smiles. It wasn't much, but it reminded her that she wasn't alone in first class. James signaled for another flight attendant, a seasoned crew member named David. David leaned in as James spoke quietly but firmly. "I need you to coordinate with the captain and inform him that there's an issue we need to address. Tell him it's about a crew member's behavior and that it's urgent." David's brow furrowed, but he nodded without question. "Understood, sir," he said before heading toward the cockpit. James sat back and folded his hands, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't going to let this slide, and he knew the only way to make a real impact was to act decisively. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Nancy was in the galley, fidgeting with the service tray. She could feel the weight of James's earlier words pressing down on her, but she pushed the thought aside. "Just get through the flight," she muttered under her breath, but her reprieve was short-lived. David turned from the cockpit, his expression serious. He leaned into Nye's ear and spoke in a low voice. "The captain wants to see you in the galley immediately." Nancy froze, her hands gripping the tray tightly. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. David shrugged slightly. "He didn't say, but it sounds important." Heart pounding, Nancy straightened her uniform and followed David to the galley near the cockpit. When she arrived, the captain stood there, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. James was seated nearby, his gaze steady as he watched the interaction unfold. "Nancy," the captain began, his voice calm but firm, "we've been made aware of an incident involving a passenger in the main cabin. Mr. Reed has raised concerns about your behavior and we need to address it immediately." Nancy's face went pale. "Sir, I don't understand. I was just doing my job," she protested weakly. The captain held up a hand to stop her. "This is not the time for excuses. I've been briefed on this, and based on Mr. Reed's account, there are serious questions about your conduct. We will be documenting this and addressing it officially once we land." Nancy's breath quickened, but she started to argue, but James interrupted. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. "Nancy, this isn't just about you, it's about the values this airline stands for, and right now your actions don't align with those values." Nancy looked from James to the captain, her heart sinking as the realization dawned this wasn't going to blow over. She was in real trouble, and everyone in the cabin would soon know it. Nancy stood frozen in the galley, her chest tightening as the captain's words echoed in her mind. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she wasn't sure if it was fear, guilt, or anger that consumed her the most. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the captain's sharp gaze silenced her. "We discuss this further once we land," he said firmly. "In the meantime, I want you to remain professional and avoid further escalation." James remained seated nearby, his calm demeanor unchanged. His presence alone seemed to sap Nancy of any lingering confidence. She gave a stiff nod and mumbled, "Understood," before turning to leave the galley. Her steps were unsteady as she made her way back to her station. For the first time in her career, she felt entirely out of control. Back in the main cabin, Sophia noticed the subtle shift in the flight crew's behavior. Rachel and another flight attendant were noticeably more attentive, offering refills, snacks, and even warm smiles to passengers who hadn't asked for anything. It was as if they were trying to undo the damage Nancy had caused. Sophia, however, remained wary. Her trust had been shaken, and while she appreciated Rachel's kindness, the earlier humiliation lingered. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to have moved on. He was busy adding more details to his drawing, oblivious to the tension that still hung in the air. The calm didn't last long. A chime rang through the cabin, followed by the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We've been alerted to a matter involving our onboard service, and I want to assure you that it's being handled with the utmost seriousness. We deeply value each of you as passengers and are committed to ensuring a respectful and enjoyable flight experience for everyone." The message was brief, but its tone was unmistakable. Passengers began exchanging curious glances, whispering among themselves. Sophia looked around, trying to gauge the reaction of those nearby. Some looked puzzled, while others appeared to piece together what was happening. A man seated across the aisle leaned toward Sophia and said quietly, "I think they're talking about what happened earlier." Sophia nodded slightly but didn't respond. She felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. On one hand, it seemed like justice might be served. On the other, she wasn't sure how public the fallout would become or how it would affect her and Daniel. Nancy, who had returned to the galley, heard the captain's announcement and felt her stomach drop. She knew the message was directed at her, even if her name wasn't mentioned. Her hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the counter, her mind racing. The passengers knew something was wrong now, and all eyes would be on her. Meanwhile, James sent another discreet message to his team on the ground. He requested a senior HR representative to be present upon landing, ensuring the situation was addressed swiftly and formally. He had no intention of letting this fade into the background. Actions like New York didn't just affect the people involved, they reflected poorly on the entire organization. As the cabin returned to a tentative quiet, James glanced towards Sophia and Daniel. Sophia caught his eye and nodded a silent acknowledgement of his efforts. James gave her a reassuring nod in return. The wheels were already in motion, and the outcome was no longer up to Nancy. The only question now was how much she would lose before the flight ended. Nancy tried to steady her hands as she moved through the first-class cabin, attempting to regain a sense of normalcy. She poured drinks with mechanical precision, avoided eye contact, and forced a tight-lipped smile at passengers who thanked her, but no amount of professional routine could mask the unease radiating from her. She knew the captain's announcement had shifted the cabin's mood, and her role in the brewing tension was no secret. In the main cabin, Sophia glanced at Daniel, who was now engrossed in adding color to his sketch. She wanted to shield him from any further drama, but her heart ached at the memory of Nana's harsh tone and dismissive attitude. She could feel the weight of stares and whispers from nearby passengers, many of whom had witnessed the earlier exchange. Some smiled at her reassuringly, while others simply looked on with quiet curiosity. Sophia turned her gaze toward the front of the plane, where James sat in calm conversation with a crew member. She didn't know who he was, but his subtle nods and the difference shown to him by the staff hinted at his importance. She had caught the faint exchange of words earlier in the galley and suspected that James wasn't just Another passenger, whoever he was, he seemed determined to set things right. And for that she felt a small glimmer of hope. Meanwhile Rachel made her way to the rear galley where Nancy was standing stiffly pretending to check the inventory. Rachel hesitated for a moment. Before speaking Nancy, she said softly, her tone careful. Are you okay? Nancy glanced at her but didn't respond immediately. Finally she muttered, I'm fine, just tired, it's been a long day. Rachel studied her for a moment, unsure whether to press further. If you need to step away for a bit, I can cover for you, she offered. Her voice kind but cautious. Nana's jaw tightened. I don't need you to cover for me, she snapped. Though her voice cracked slightly at the end, she immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone but didn't apologize. Rachel blinked, taken aback, and stepped back without another word. The tension between the two was palpable, unbeknownst to Nancy. Passengers in the cabin were becoming more aware of her demeanor. Her stiffness and avoidance stood out, especially against the backdrop of Rachel's warmth and attentiveness. Sophia caught a glimpse of Nancy in the galley, her rigid posture betraying her discomfort. She wondered if the flight attendant was beginning to grasp the gravity of her actions. James, meanwhile, had returned to his seat, but his attention was far from the movie playing on the screen in front of him. His phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen and saw an update from his team. HRRE confirmed on-site security notified to assist if necessary, awaiting landing for further action. James read the message, his expression unreadable. He tucked his phone back into his pocket and leaned back in his seat, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. He had dealt with situations like this before, but they never became easier. Watching someone face the consequences of their actions was necessary but rarely pleasant. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Nancy felt a growing sense of dread. The captain's stern words, James's quiet authority, and the whispers among passengers all pointed to an outcome she couldn't control. Her pride kept her from admitting fault, but deep down she felt the weight of regret. She had always prided herself on being firm but fair, a professional who followed the rules, yet today something in her had snapped, and now she was paying the price. Back in the main cab, and Daniel suddenly looked up from his drawing. Mom, are we in the clouds yet? He asked, his voice tinged with excitement. Sophia smiled softly and nodded. We are, baby, look out the window. Daniel pressed his face against the window, his earlier joy returning as he stared at the endless expanse of white. His innocent curiosity melted some of Sophia's tension, but the memory of the incident still lingered. She glanced at her watch, silently willing the flight to land sooner. Nancy too watched the minutes tick by, each one stretching longer than the last. The hum of the engines and the muffled sounds of passengers' chatter did nothing to quiet her racing thoughts. She replayed the events of the day in her mind, trying to pinpoint where things had gone wrong, but the truth was inescapable. She had made assumptions, snapped judgments that were now unraveling her carefully built career. As the plane's intercom chimed again, signaling the crew to prepare for descent, Nana's heart sank further. She could feel the end of the flight drawing near, and with it the reckoning she could no longer avoid. Meanwhile James sat calmly in his seat. Sophia comforted Daniel as he stared out the window, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The intercom announcement for descent heightened the tension in the cabin. Flight attendants began their final checks, moving through the aisles to ensure seat belts were fastened and tray tables were stowed. Rachel's kind demeanor stood in stark contrast to Nye's rigid, almost mechanical movements. Passengers couldn't help but notice the difference, exchanging glances as Nancy avoided even the most basic interactions. Sophia adjusted Daniel's seat belt, her hands steady despite the tight knot in her stomach. She wanted to forget the earlier humiliation, but every time she glanced toward the galley, the image of Nye's sharp expression and raised voice replayed in her mind. Daniel seemed blissfully unaware of the ongoing tension, his attention still fixed on the window. His excitement about being in the clouds brought a bittersweet smile to Sophia's face. She wished his first flight had been nothing but joy in first class. James was seated upright, his phone vibrating softly against his palm. Another message had arrived from his team's security and HR positioned at the gate prepared to act as soon as the flight lands. Please advise if further instructions are needed. James responded with a simple proceed is planned. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath, his expression firm. He had spent years ensuring that the airline maintained its reputation for customer care and professionalism. This incident wasn't just a breach of those values, it was a personal affront to everything he had worked for. Today he intended to send a clear message not just to Nancy but to the entire staff that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated. As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. Nancy moved through her tasks like a robot, her mind spinning with possibilities. She glanced toward the cockpit hoping for some reassurance from the captain, but he was busy coordinating the landing. She could feel James's eyes on her from first class, though he remained seated, his expression unreadable. Passengers in the main cabin noticed the shift as well. Whispers became louder and curious glances were exchanged. One man leaned toward Sophia, his voice low. Do you think she's in trouble? He asked, gesturing discreetly toward Nancy. Sophia hesitated before answering. I don't know, she replied softly, her eyes flickering toward Nancy, but someone is definitely paying attention. Nancy felt those glances like 1,000 tiny pricks against her skin. The usual authority she carried as a senior flight attendant had vanished, replaced by a gnawing sense of vulnerability. She tried to focus on the final safety checks, but her hands trembled as she buckled a passenger seat belt. The man gave her a strange look but said nothing. The plane touched down smoothly and a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. For most passengers the flight had been uneventful save for the tense undercurrent created by Nye's earlier outburst. As the plane taxied to the gate, James stood and retrieved his briefcase. His movements deliberate, he made his way to the galley near the cockpit where Nancy stood stiffly, her eyes downcast. Nancy, he said, his tone quiet but firm, once we're at the gate I'll need you to step aside and speak with me. And the captain, Nye's throat tightened, but she managed a weak nod. Yes sir, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words speak with me felt ominous and she could feel her palms sweating. Passengers began to unbuckle their seat belts as the plane came to a full stop. The cabin crew opened the doors and the cool air of the jet bridge swept into the plane. People stood reaching for their luggage in the overhead bins. Nancy stayed rooted in place, her hands clutching the edge of a counter. She didn't dare meet anyone's gaze. James stepped aside to allow passengers to disembark, but his eyes remained on Nancy. Sophia and Daniel gathered their belongings, ready to join the line of people exiting the plane. As they reached the aisle, Rachel stopped them with a warm smile. Thank you for flying with us, she said gently. I hope the rest of your trip is wonderful. Sophia returned the smile, appreciating the sincerity in Rachel's tone. She glanced back once at Nancy, who was still standing frozen in the galley. Nye's rigid form was a stark reminder of the earlier conflict, but Sophia pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on her son. Daniel grinned as they stepped into the jet bridge, his excitement about their destination overpowering any lingering discomfort. But not everyone could move on so easily. As the last passenger exited, James nodded toward the HR representative waiting just outside the plane door. A man in a crisp suit stepped inside, flanked by two security personnel. The HR representative's calm but firm demeanor mirrored James's. Nancy's eyes widened as she realized what was happening, her stomach twisted with dread. Nancy Smith, the HR representative began, his voice professional but unyielding. We've been informed of an incident during this flight involving a passenger. We will need to have a formal discussion about this immediately. Nancy's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. James stepped forward, his voice cutting through the thick silence. Nancy, your actions today reflect poorly on this airline and everything it stands for. There will be an investigation, but based on what I've witnessed, your behavior is unacceptable. The passengers who had lingered just beyond the jet bridge turned, their eyes widening as they caught sight of the scene. Whispers started again, louder this time as Nancy Stood frozen. The HR representative gestured toward the exit. Please follow us, Miss Smith, he said firmly. Nancy hesitated, glancing around as though searching for someone to defend her, but no one stepped forward. Rachel avoided her gaze and the other crew members remained silent. Finally Nancy took a shaky step forward, her shoulders slumping in defeat as she followed the HR team and security personnel off the plane. James stood silently watching her go. His expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. He turned to Rachel and the other crew members. Thank you for handling the situation professionally, he said simply before stepping off the plane himself. In the terminal, Sophia and Daniel waited near the baggage claim. Daniel had resumed sketching, his head bowed over his notebook. Sophia glanced around, noticing the buzz among other passengers as they discussed what had just unfolded. She wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her was relieved that someone had stepped in, but another part of her felt exhausted by the entire ordeal. She glanced at her son and decided that for now she would focus on him and the memories they were about to create on their trip. As Nancy disappeared into the airport's administrative offices, her fate now in the hands of HR and the airline's policies, the terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But for those who had witnessed what happened, the flight was one they wouldn't forget. For James, Sophia and even Nancy, the repercussions of this day were just beginning to unfold. Inside the airport's administrative offices, Nancy sat in a small, starkly lit room. The HR representative and two security personnel stood nearby, their expressions neutral but firm. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her as she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her usually sharp posture had wilted, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had never felt more out of place in her own uniform. The HR representative, a man named Martin, sat across from her, a folder of documents resting neatly on the table between them. His demeanor was professional but unyielding, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Miss Smith, he began, flipping open the folder, we are here to address a complaint that was formally raised during your flight. This pertains to your behavior toward a passenger and their child. Nancy swallowed hard, her throat dry. She opened her mouth to respond, but Martin continued before she could. We have statements from multiple witnesses, including a senior airline executive who was present on the flight. The accounts are consistent. Your actions were inappropriate and unprofessional, and they do not align with the standards of our airline. Nana's voice wavered as she finally spoke. I didn't mean for it to escalate like this, she stammered. I was just trying to enforce the rules. That child was leaning into the aisle and Martin held up a hand, silencing her. Miss Smith, enforcing safety rules is part of your job, but the way you handle passengers matters just as much. This wasn't about safety, it was about your tone, your attitude, and the assumptions you made about that family. Nye's eyes darted to the security personnel who stood silently by the door. She felt trapped, her words crumbling under the weight of Martin's calm authority. I've been with this airline for years, she said, her voice pleading. This was just a misunderstanding. Martin leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Your record shows that this isn't the first time concerns have been raised about your interactions with passengers. While those incidents were resolved with warnings, this time is different. This time a senior executive witnessed the behavior firsthand, and the impact on the passengers involved cannot be ignored. Nana's stomach churned as Martin's words sank in. She had always assumed her seniority would shield her from serious consequences, but now for the first time she realized just how precarious her position had become. Please, she said, her voice trembling, I'm willing to apologize to the family. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Martin's expression softened, but only slightly. Apologies are important, Miss Smith, but they can't undo what's been done. This incident has already reached the airline's executive board, and they've made it clear that actions need to be taken to uphold our commitment to respect and fairness. Nana's chest tightened and she felt the air in the room grow heavier. She had always believed she was untouchable, a reliable long-term employee who could weather any storm, but now, as Martin's words echoed in her Mind she saw how her own actions had brought her to this point. Meanwhile back in the terminal Sophia and Daniel were waiting for their luggage. Sophia sat on a bench watching her son carefully sketch a bird he had seen during their drive to the airport. His small concentrated face brought her a sense of calm she desperately needed after the chaos of the flight. A woman approached her, one of the passengers who had been seated nearby during the incident. "Excuse me," the woman said gently, "I just wanted to say I think you handled yourself with a lot of grace back there. I'm sorry for what you and your son went through." Sophia offered a small tired smile. "Thank you, that means a lot," she said quietly. She appreciated the support but wished it hadn't been necessary in the first place. The woman hesitated before continuing, "I think it's good that someone noticed and stepped in. That man from first class, do you know who he is?" Sophia shook her head. "I don't, but I'm grateful he was there. He seemed to understand what needed to be done at that moment." James himself walked through the terminal, his expression composed but thoughtful. He spotted Sophia and Daniel near the luggage carousel and made his way toward them. When he reached them he paused, giving Sophia a respectful nod. "I just wanted to check in and make sure you and your son are doing okay," James said, his voice calm and steady. Sophia looked up, surprised but grateful. "We're okay, thank you. I appreciate you stepping in back there." James smiled faintly. "It was the right thing to do. No one should have to go through what you did today." He crouched slightly to meet Daniel's eye level. "And you, young man, are you still drawing?" Daniel nodded eagerly and held up his sketchbook. "I drew the plane in the clouds and now I'm drawing a bird we saw earlier." James's smile widened. "You're very talented, keep at it." He straightened and turned back to Sophia. "I want to assure you that the airline is taking this matter seriously. We'll be conducting a full review to make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Sophia nodded, her expression softening. "That means a lot, thank you." As James walked away, Sophia felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't know what the final outcome would be, but she felt a sense of validation. Someone had seen her and Daniel for who they were, and that made all the difference. Back in the administrative office, Nancy sat in stunned silence as Martin delivered his final remarks. "Effective immediately, you are suspended. Pending a full review by the disciplinary board, you'll receive further communication regarding the next steps, but as of now you are relieved of duty." Nancy felt the words hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to argue but nothing came out. All she could do was nod numbly as Martin stood and gestured to the security personnel. "They'll escort you out," he said firmly as Nancy walked through the terminal, her head low and her uniform now feeling like a burden. She caught sight of Sophia and Daniel in the distance. Her chest tightened with a pang of regret, but she couldn't bring herself to approach them. Instead she kept walking, knowing that her actions had set this chain of events in motion. For the first time she understood the full impact of her choices and the consequences they carried. Nancy shuffled through the terminal, her steps heavy and uncertain. The weight of the suspension and the public humiliation hung over her like a storm cloud. She avoided the eyes of passing passengers, feeling the unspoken judgment in their curious glance. Her mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. Years of service, countless flights, and the respect she had once commanded gone in a matter of hours. As she reached the employee exit, Nancy paused and leaned against a wall, her breathing shallow. Her hands trembled as she took out her phone and scrolled through her messages. There were none, no support, no sympathy, not even from her co-workers. For the first time she felt utterly alone. The realization struck her hard. The power she once wielded in her role as a senior flight attendant had been stripped away, and now she was left to face the fallout. Meanwhile, back at the luggage carousel, Sophia and Daniel stood patiently waiting for their suitcase to appear. Daniel clutched his sketchbook tightly, occasionally flipping through the pages to show his mother his work. Sophia smiled, her heart warmed by his enthusiasm, but the events of the flight still lingered in the back of her mind. She glanced around, noticing the subdued chatter of other passengers who had also been on the plane. The story was spreading, and it seemed everyone had Something to say about what had happened. One of the passengers, a middle-aged man in a business suit, approached Sophia. Hesitantly, "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I just wanted to say that I admire the way you handled yourself back there. It couldn't have been easy." Sophia nodded, offering a polite smile. "Thank you, it wasn't, but I didn't want to make things worse for my son." The man smiled faintly, nodding in understanding. "Well, I think you set an example for him and for the rest of us." As the man walked away, Sophia glanced down at Daniel, who was now preoccupied with adjusting his shoelace. She reached out and smoothed his hair gently, silently hoping that the incident hadn't left a lasting impression on him. A short distance away, James Reed stood near a gate agent, speaking quietly but with authority. "Make sure this is documented thoroughly," he instructed. "The board will want a full report including passenger statements." The gate agent nodded, taking notes on a tablet. "Understood, Mr. Reed. We've already flagged the incident for review and have gathered preliminary accounts from the flight crew." James nodded, satisfied. "If good, this is about more than just one person's behavior. We need to ensure our entire staff understands that this kind of treatment is unacceptable." As the conversation ended, James turned and spotted Sophia and Daniel at the luggage carousel. He hesitated for a moment before walking over. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone warm but professional, "I wanted to check in one more time before you leave." Sophia looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thank you, Mr. Reed, we're fine really." Daniel's excited for our trip and I just want to focus on that." James nodded, his expression softening. "I understand, but I want you to know that we're taking this seriously. What happened today was unacceptable and I've already initiated steps to address it. You have my assurance that this won't be ignored." Sophia appreciated his sincerity. "That means a lot," she said quietly. "I just hope this makes a difference, not just for me and Daniel but for anyone else who might find themselves in a similar situation." James's gaze was steady. I'll make sure of it." As James walked away, Sophia exhaled deeply. For the first time since the flight, she felt a small sense of closure. She couldn't change what had happened, but knowing that someone in James's position was advocating for her and her son gave her a sense of validation. Elsewhere, Nancy sat in her car, parked in the farthest corner of the employee lot. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The silence around her was suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of passing vehicles. She stared at the windshield, her mind replaying the events of the day. The words from the HR representative, the captain, and James swirled together, forming a storm of regret and anger. She reached for her phone and opened her email. She hesitated for a moment before typing a message addressed to the airline's HR department. The words came slowly at first, but as she wrote they began to flow more freely. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to formally address the incident that occurred on today's flight. While I do not believe my intentions were malicious, I understand now that my actions were perceived as disrespectful and inappropriate. I acted out of frustration and poor judgment, and for that I deeply apologize, particularly to the passenger and her son who were affected by my behavior." Nancy paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She took a deep breath and continued, "I recognized that my conduct fell far short of the standards expected of me as a senior flight attendant. I also acknowledge that this incident reflects a broader issue, one that I now understand I contributed to. I am committed to reflecting on my actions and making the necessary changes to ensure this never happens again." She reread the email several times before hitting send. As the message disappeared from her screen, she leaned back in her seat, a small part of her relieved. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she had to start somewhere. Back in the terminal, Sophia and Daniel collected their suitcase and began making their way toward the exit. As they stepped out into the crisp air, Daniel looked up at his mother and smiled. "Mom, can we go to the beach first?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement. Sophia laughed softly and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, the beach sounds perfect." For Sophia, the incident on the flight was already beginning to fade into the background. For Daniel, the Memory of the clouds in the promise of the ocean had completely overshadowed the earlier tension, but for Nancy and Jane Ames the ripple effects of that day were only just beginning. Nancy drove away from the airport, her grip on the steering wheel tight, her mind spiraling with a mix of emotions, guilt, frustration, and a growing sense of fear. Her career, which she had worked so hard to build, now felt as though it was slipping through her fingers. The road ahead blurred as her thoughts took over, replaying the faces of the passengers, the stern expression of James Reed, and the quiet disappointment in the captain's voice. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, jolting her out of her daze. For a moment she considered ignoring it, but something compelled her to check. She pulled into a quiet parking lot and picked up the phone. The message was from a former colleague, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. "Nancy, I heard what happened. Call me if you want to talk. I've been there." The words hit her like a wave, stirring up an uncomfortable mix of anger and sadness. She couldn't decide if the message was meant to comfort her or to remind her of how far she had fallen. She placed the phone back in the cup holder without responding, staring blankly at the dashboard. As she sat there, she thought about what had led her to this point. She remembered the early days of her career when she had been eager and idealistic, determined to provide passengers with the best experience possible. But somewhere along the way, the long hours, the demanding schedules, and her own personal frustrations had hardened her. She had started seeing passengers as problems to solve rather than people to serve, and now that perspective had cost her more than she ever imagined. Across the city, James Reed was settling into his office at the airline's headquarters. His desk was clean and orderly, with a single file folder placed squarely in the center. Inside was the report on Nancy Smith, complete with witness statements, crew accounts, and his own observations. He flipped through the pages carefully, his face expressionless but his mind working quickly. James had no desire to destroy someone's career. He knew the pressure flight attendants faced, the exhaustion of long shifts and demanding passengers, but he also knew that the kind of behavior Nancy had displayed couldn't be ignored. It wasn't just about one incident, it was about what it represented, a deeper issue within the airline's culture that needed to be addressed. And as he read through the report, James received an email from the airline's CEO. The subject line was "Brief Incident Review, Immediate Action Required." He opened it and read the contents carefully. "James, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. The board agrees that swift action is necessary to uphold our values. In addition to addressing the individual involved, I would like you to spearhead a review of our current training programs with a focus on sensitivity and bias awareness. Please prepare a proposal for the next board meeting. Let's ensure this becomes a learning moment for the entire organization." James leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in thought. The CEO's directive aligned perfectly with what he had already decided. The airline didn't just need to react to this incident, it needed to evolve. Meanwhile, Sophia and Daniel were settling into their hotel room at their beachside destination. Daniel ran excitedly to the balcony, pressing his face against the glass as he stared at the waves crashing on the shore. "Mom, look," he exclaimed, "the ocean is so big." Sophia smiled and joined him at the window, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It is, baby, and it's all ours to enjoy this week." As Daniel began chattering about building sand castles and collecting seashells, Sophia's phone buzzed on the bedside table. She picked it up and saw an email notification from the airline. The subject line read, "Our apologies and next steps." She hesitated for a moment before opening it. The email was formal but heartfelt. "Dear Miss Carter, on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the experience you and your son endured on Flight 287. Our passengers' comfort and dignity are our highest priorities, and we deeply regret that this was not reflected in your treatment. Please know that we are taking this matter very seriously. The flight attendant involved has been suspended pending a full review, and we are implementing immediate measures to ensure similar incidents do not occur in the future. As a token of our commitment to making this right. We have credited your account with 50,000 reward miles which can be used for any future travel. Additionally, our customer relations team is available to discuss any further concerns or requests you may have. Thank you for bringing this to our attention, and we hope to regain your trust in the future. Sophia read the email twice. Her emotions mixed. The apology felt genuine and the actions outlined seemed like a step in the right direction, but a part of her still felt the sting of the humiliation she and Daniel had faced. She placed the phone back on the table and turned to her son, deciding to focus on the joy he was radiating in that moment. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophia sat on the beach watching Daniel dig enthusiastically in the sand. Her thoughts drifted back to James, the way he had quietly stepped in to help and the professionalism he had shown in handling the situation. She didn't know if she would ever fly with the airline again, but she hoped that his efforts would make a difference for others. Back in the parking lot, Nancy remained in her car scrolling through old photos on her phone. She paused on a picture of herself in her uniform from years ago, standing proudly in front of an airplane. She barely recognized the woman in the photo, confident, excited, and full of hope for the future. The person she'd become felt distant, as though she had lost her way for the first time since the flight. Nancy allowed herself to feel the weight of her actions fully. She thought about the boy's wide eyes, his quiet confusion, and the protective way his mother had held him. She had taken something from them, something she couldn't give back. The realization hit her hard and she lowered her head, tears streaming silently down her face. James, now at home after a long day, sat in his living room with a laptop open. He began drafting the proposal the CEO had requested, outlining steps for a comprehensive training program that would include real-world scenarios, bias awareness, and stronger accountability measures. As he typed, he couldn't help but think about the faces of the passengers on the flight, their whispers, their glances, and the quiet strength of the woman and her son, who had endured far more than they should have. The ripple effects of that day were far from over, but for James, Sophia, Daniel, and even Nancy, the flight had become more than just an incident. It was a turning point, one that would shape the paths they would take from that moment forward. The following morning, the airline's board convened for an emergency meeting at their headquarters. James arrived early, his proposal neatly organized in a sleek black folder under his arm. The room was filled with the quiet murmur of executives exchanging pleasantries, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Everyone knew that the incident on Flight 287 had not only sparked outrage among the passengers, but it also exposed deeper flaws in the company's internal culture. As the meeting began, the CEO, Richard Hale, took his place at the head of the table. His usual air of confidence was tempered with a seriousness that matched the gravity of the situation. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady, we here today to address a matter that has highlighted significant gaps in our training and oversight processes. While this incident involves an individual employee, it reflects broader issues we can no longer afford to overlook. He turned to James, nodding for him to begin. James stood, his calm demeanor commanding the room's attention. Thank you, Richard, he said. What happened on Flight 287 was unacceptable. The treatment of M. Carter and her son not only violated their trust as passengers but also undermined the values we claim to uphold as an airline. James clicked a remote, projecting a sled onto the screen behind him. It displayed the core pillars of the airline's mission statement: respect, safety, and excellence. He gestured to the words as he continued, incidents like this erode the foundation of these principles. The way we respond now will define not only our company's reputation but also the trust of every passenger who chooses to fly with us. The room was silent as James laid out his proposal. It included mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, a new accountability framework for handling complaints, and regular assessments to ensure compliance. He also proposed a dedicated passenger advocate team to address grievances swiftly and Empathetically, this isn't just about damage control, James concluded, it's about fostering a culture where incidents like this are prevented, not just addressed after the fact. It's about making every employee understand the weight of their actions and the responsibility they carry as representatives of this airline. The room remained quiet for a moment before one of the board members, a woman named Elaine, spoke up. James, the first, appreciate the thoroughness of your plan. But do you think this level of intervention is necessary for what was ultimately one employee's poor decision? James met her gaze evenly. Yes, Elaine, I do. This wasn't an isolated incident. While reviewing this case, I came across other complaints, similar issues of bias, lapses in judgment, and a lack of accountability. If we don't address the systemic problem, it's only a matter of time before something worse happens. Elaine nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Richard Hale leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I agree, he said firmly. We can't afford to view this as a one-off situation. James, the first, want your plan implemented immediately. I'll present it to the broader leadership team this afternoon. James gave a small nod, relief washing over him. The battle for change was far from over, but this was an important first step. Meanwhile, Sophia and Daniel were enjoying their second day at the beach. The sunlight sparkled on the waves as Daniel ran along the shore, his laughter carried by the sea breeze. Sophia watched him from a beach chair, her heart lighter than it had been in days. She had decided to put the incident behind her, focusing instead on the joy of their trip. For Daniel, the entire ordeal seemed like a distant memory. His world was now filled with sand castles and seashells. But even as Sophia tried to move forward, the airline's apology email lingered in her mind. It wasn't the compensation or the promise of changes that stuck with her, it was the idea that something might genuinely shift because of what happened to her and Daniel. She wanted to believe that their experience could lead to a better environment meant for others, even if the process wasn't immediate. Back in the city, Nancy sat in her small apartment staring at her computer screen. The email she had sent to the HR department the night before remained unanswered, but she hadn't expected an immediate reply. What consumed her now was the emptiness of her inbox and the realization of how quickly her professional network had dissolved. She opened her social media accounts, scrolling through the curated lives of her colleagues and acquaintances. It was a painful contrast to her own reality. She thought about reaching out to someone, anyone, for support, but every name she considered was accompanied by the fear of rejection or judgment. Her eyes landed on a message thread with her older sister, someone she hadn't spoken to in over a year due to a falling out. Nancy hesitated, her finger hovering over the call button. Finally she pressed it and the phone rang. Hello, her sister's voice came through, cautious but familiar. It's me, Nancy said quietly. I need someone to talk to. The silence on the other end was heavy, but then her sister spoke, her tone softening. I'm here. What's going on? As Nancy began to talk, the words came tumbling out, her frustration, her regret, her fear of what the future held. For the first time in a long while she allowed herself to be vulnerable. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the beginning of something she hadn't dared to hope for, a chance to rebuild. At the same time, James sat at his desk drafting an internal memo to all staff. He chose his words carefully, knowing that the tone of the message would set the stage for the changes he intended to implement to all staff in light of recent events. We are taking immediate steps to ensure that our airline remains a leader in professionalism, respect and inclusivity. These values are not negotiable, and every employee is expected to embody them in their daily interactions. We will be introducing new training programs and accountability measures in the coming weeks. Participation will be mandatory for all employees regardless of role or seniority. Together we can create an environment where every passenger feels valued and respected. Thank you for your commitment to excellence, James said, knowing the road ahead would be challenging, but as he leaned back in his chair he felt a sense of resolve. The events of Flight 287 had exposed weaknesses in the system, but they had also provided an opportunity to build something stronger. It was up to him and everyone in the organization to seize that opportunity and ensure it wasn't wasted. Nancy spent the rest of the day reflecting on her conversation with her sister. It had been painful to open up, but it also felt like a small step toward understanding where she had gone wrong, not just on the flight but in how she had approached her entire career. Her sister had listened without judgment, offering quiet support and the occasional tough question that forced Nancy to confront her own biases. "You sound like you've been angry for a long time," her sister had said, "but who are you really angry at? The passengers, your job? Or maybe yourself?" Nancy hadn't been able to answer right away. Now sitting alone in her apartment, her sister's words lingered in her mind. She stared at the uniform hanging on the back of her bedroom door, a stark reminder of the identity she had built and the authority she had wielded. It had once made her feel proud, important. Now it felt like a hollow shell of something she no longer recognized. Meanwhile, the airline was moving quickly to address the fallout from the incident. James's internal memo had sparked a flurry of activity across departments. Training managers began drafting updated sensitivity and bias training modules, while HR teams reviewed past complaints to identify patterns that might have been overlooked. The airline's legal team worked on drafting an official public statement, ensuring it conveyed sincerity without admitting liability. James had spent most of the day in back-to-back meetings, but by late afternoon he finally had a moment to pause. He sat in his office sipping a cup of coffee as he reviewed an email from Sophia. She had written a thoughtful response to the airline's apology, expressing her appreciation for the efforts being made while also emphasizing the importance of follow-through. "I hope these changes are not just words on paper," Sophia had written. "As a parent, I need to accept that my child and I made a difference enough to have an effect. Kindly keep on focusing on activity over appearances." James respected her candor and added her email to the developing record of archives he wanted to introduce at the following executive gathering. Her words epitomized precisely exact thing he was attempting to accomplish: enduring significant change, not simply a brief PR fix. Somewhere else, Sophia and Daniel were partaking in their night at the ocean side. Daniel had gone through hours gathering ocean shells, his little hands cautiously arranging them by size and variety. He gladly showed off his assortment to Sophia, who grinned energetically and supported his excitement for her. This excursion had become something beyond a getaway. It was an opportunity to reset, to center around the delight of being with her child as the sun plunged beneath the skyline, turning the sky shades of pink and orange. Sophia couldn't resist the opportunity to consider the occasions of the beyond couple of days. She contemplated the second Nancy had shouted at Daniel, the sharp sting of embarrassment and vulnerability she had felt, yet she additionally contemplated the way James had mediated, the tranquil strength he had displayed in considering the aircraft responsible. She looked at her telephone, where the airline expression of remorse email was as yet open. For a second she considered answering again, however at that point she ruled against it. She had currently expressed out loud whatever should have been said. Now it depended on them to demonstrate that their words conveyed. Stand by. Back in the city, James was on a video call with Richard Hale and a few board individuals. The discussion had been useful, however tense, with every part saying something regarding the proposed changes. Richard inclined forward, his appearance serious as he tended to the gathering. "Let us be clear," he said, "this is about something beyond one representative or one episode. This is about the way of life we've permitted to flourish here. On the off chance that we don't make a move to set another standard, we're telling our travelers, furthermore, our staff, that we don't esteem responsibility. I won't allow that to occur." The board individuals gestured, some more hesitantly than others. James shouted out, his tone consistent however firm, "I concur, yet we likewise need to guarantee that these progressions are maintainable. It's sufficiently not to prepare individuals once and tap out. We want standard evaluations, open lines of correspondence for staff and travelers, and a pledge to non-stop Improvement. The gathering finished with a consistent vote to endorse James' proposition. As the screen went dim, James permitted himself an uncommon snapshot of fulfillment. This was only the start. In any case, it was a positive development. That night Nancy got an email from the carrier's HR office. The headline was unmistakable: notification of formal disciplinary activity. Her heart sank as she opened it. The message framed the discoveries of the examination. Her conduct on the flight had been considered improper and amateurish, with various observer proclamations supporting the occurrence taking effect. Right now her suspension was being broadened. Forthcoming a last survey by the Disciplinary Council. Nancy read the email 2 times, her chest fixing with each word. She realized this result was unavoidable, yet seeing it recorded as a hard copy caused it to feel genuinely in a manner it hadn't previously. She put her telephone down and gazed at the uniform actually holding tight her entryway, the individual she had become while wearing it. The individual who had let disappointment and predisposition guide her activities felt like a more unusual. She got her telephone once more. Furthermore, opened another email draft. This time she composed straightforwardly to James Reed, whose name had been referenced over and over in the HR correspondence. Mr. Reed, I realize you don't owe me everything, except I needed to. Much thanks to you for taking care of this present circumstance with reasonableness. I can't change what I did. Be that as it may, I've begun to think about why it worked out and how I let myself arrive at this point, on the off chance that there's some way I would be able add to the progressions you're making. I'm willing to attempt. I need to be essential for the arrangement, regardless of whether I can never again be part of the group. Nancy gazed at the draft for a few minutes prior to hitting send. She couldn't say whether she would get a reaction, yet interestingly she felt like she was assuming a sense of ownership with her activities. James saw the email sometime thereafter. He read it cautiously, noticing the tone of certified lament. He didn't answer right away, however he gave careful consideration to remember her proposal for his next gathering with the load up. Recovery was generally difficult, yet now and again it was worth considering. As Nancy sat in her calm condo, Sophia and Daniel strolled hand close by along the twilight ocean side, and James arranged for one more drawn-out day of driving change. Every one of them conveyed the weight of the episode in their own specific manner. For Nancy it was an example she had advanced past the point of no return. For Sophia it was an indication of her solidarity as a mother, and for James it was a source of inspiration that had previously started to echo through the aircraft's culture. The weeks following the occurrence on Flight 287 brought apparent changes both for the aircraft and individuals, included Nancy, who had at first attempted to acknowledge her suspension, chose to remove the time as a chance to reconsider her needs. She pursued a progression of studios zeroed in on understood predisposition and the capacity to understand people on a deeper level, and keeping in mind that the meetings were awkward now and again, they constrained her to stand up to the examples of conduct that had prompted her destruction. In one of the studios the facilitator asked, "What suppositions do you make about others without acknowledging it?" Nancy wound up considering Daniel and Sophia of the short second when she had excused them not as esteemed travelers, however, as burdens. It was a hard truth to confront, yet it likewise turned into the establishment of her endeavors to change. In the meantime, James' proposition was getting some decent momentum. Inside the carrier, the primary round of required awareness preparing was carried out across all divisions, and the criticism was predominantly shore workers started sharing accounts of their own predispositions, gaining from each other in ways that hadn't been imaginable before. The carrier likewise settled a committed traveler promotion group, an immediate result of the occurrence, to address worries with sympathy and productivity. One evening, James got a message from the president preparing send-off, a triumph, positive reactions from staff and travelers. Gratitude for your authority on this. James grinned faintly, yet he didn't permit himself to become careless. He realized the genuine test would keep up with these progressions over the long haul. For Sophia, the episode turned out to be to a lesser degree a difficult memory and to a greater extent a calm confirmation of her strength. As the weeks passed, she zeroed in on her work and her job as a mother, guaranteeing that Daniel proceeded to flourish. One night she found him at the kitchen table cautiously drawing a plane encompassed by fleecy mists. "Is that our plane?" she asked, sitting adjacent to him. Daniel gestured energetically. "Definitely, yet I improved it. See, it has a rainbow now." He highlighted the beautiful stripes he had added along the PL's wings. Sophia grinned, unsettling his hair. "It's ideal," she said. Her voice loaded up with warmth. At that time she understood how far they had come since the trip. While the memory of Nana's unforgiving words actually waited, they had been eclipsed by the generosity of outsiders, the help of the carrier, and her own assurance to push ahead. Nancy also was viewing as her way forward. She presently couldn't seem to hear an official choice from the disciplinary council. However, she enjoyed made harmony with anything the result could be. She had started chipping in at a nearby not-for-profit that zeroed in on working environment value, sharing her story as a useful example and paying attention to other people who had confronted separation. It was lowering work, yet it provided her a feeling of motivation she hadn't felt in years. One evening as she was leaving a studio, she got an email from James. The title read "Subsequent Stages." Her heart dashed as she opened it. "Miss Smith, thank you for connecting and for the means you've taken to reflect and develop while your situation with the carrier stays under audit. I trust your proposal to add to our preparation endeavors has esteem. In the event that you're willing, I might want to welcome you to join one of our impending meetings as a visitor speaker. Your viewpoint could act as a significant illustration for other people and help support the progressions we're carrying out." Nancy gazed at the email, her feelings whirling. It wasn't pardoning, however, it was an opportunity to assume liability and add to something better. She composed a speedy answer. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. I would be respected to assist in any capacity." I with canning. Months after the fact, Nancy remained in a meeting room loaded up with carrier staff sharing her story as a feature of an instructional meeting. She talked straightforwardly about her missteps, her suppositions, and the examples she had taken. In the room hushed up, the crowd mindful. When she completed, there was a snapshot of quiet before the room ejected into commendation. It wasn't reclamation, not totally, however it was a stage toward it, and simultaneously Sophia and Daniel were on one more flight, this time with an alternate carrier. As they sunk into their seats, a well-disposed airline steward moved toward, offering Daniel a couple of wings to stick to his shirt. "For our lesser flyer," she said with a grin. Daniel smiled, sticking the wings to his chest with satisfaction. Sophia said thanks to the specialist and reclined in her seat, feeling a sense of harmony she hadn't felt during their last outing. As the plane took off, Daniel squeezed his yet again face against the window, wondering about the mists for James, Nancy, Sophia. What's more, Daniel, the occurrence on Flight 287 had set off a chain of occasions not a single one of them might have anticipated. It had uncovered imperfections, constrained troublesome discussions, and ignited significant change. And keeping in mind that the venture wasn't over for any of them, each had figured out how to take the examples of that day and push ahead, more shrewd, more grounded, still up in the air, to improve things. Gratitude for watching. In the event that you partook in this story, make certain to raise a ruckus around town. Like button, share your considerations in the remarks, and remember to buy in for additional recordings like this.